A secluded country road plunged into the deep darkness of night. A car sped by, then suddenly slammed on its brakes. The driver was horrified to realize the terrifying truth. Amidst the quiet night, in the raging inferno, was not a bush, but a burning human body. Instantly, the road became a crime scene. Connecticut State Police cordoned off the area, meticulously searching every square foot. But the victim was so badly burned they were beyond recognition.
Her body was charred beyond recognition.
Nobody knew who she was. Nobody knew what happened to her.
I said, you're the prime target because you're beautiful and everybody wants you.
The charred, unrecognizable body was meticulously wrapped in multiple layers of material. Plastic, blankets, bed sheets, and duct tape, as if the killer had deliberately sealed them around the victim. From these bindings alone, investigators immediately recognized this as a dump site, not where the victim had been murdered. Connecticut detectives placed their hope in the office of the chief medical examiner to identify the burned body. Dr. Ira Confer, a forensic pathologist with 3 decades of experience and over 4,000 autopsies under his belt, took on the case. For him, the job demanded a comfort level with horrors that many other doctors never had to face. When the body arrived, it was still encased in plastic bags. Upon opening them, investigators discovered even more layers of wrapping and had to proceed with extreme caution to avoid destroying any evidence. The goal was to preserve the scene as much as possible so that police could collect fingerprints and DNA, offering clues to the perpetrator. Through the autopsy, the victim was identified as a young woman, approximately 20 years old. She was believed to be a light-skinned black female or possibly of Hispanic descent. The body was missing its nose, ears, fingers, toes, and a section of skin from one ankle. The first thing Dr. Canfer considered was that the killer was attempting to conceal the victim's identity. There were no fingers to take prints from, no toes. If she had rings or tattoos, those features no longer served identification purposes. Identifying her became much harder when identifying features like her nose, fingertips, and other characteristics were removed, but not impossible. The front of the victim's torso was far more severely burned than her back, indicating that when she was set on fire, she was lying on her back. When the body was flipped over, the lower back area that had been pressed against the ground was fairly well preserved. In this area, a section of skin from the lower back was missing. It wasn't just missing, it was clearly, upon looking at the body and the photos, cut out. The assumption was that there had been a tattoo there. Connecticut detectives searched state databases for any missing, light-skinned young women with a large lower back tattoo, but they found nothing. When they expanded their search to surrounding counties, they found a lead. It was a missing persons case about 80 miles away in Long Island, New York. Rebecca Koster. Rebecca, 24 years old, was a nursing assistant living with her parents. The missing persons report had been filed by her father, Larry Ross. He called the police because her job had reported her absent that day. The night before, she had been out with friends, and no one had seen her since 3:30 a.m. that morning. The missing persons flyer included a picture of Rebecca, describing her height, weight, and hair color. Notably, it also mentioned a specific identifying feature, a large tattoo believed to be a butterfly on her lower back. Despite the striking similarities between the two women, Connecticut detectives remained skeptical. They didn't have a match due to the geographical distance. They reached out to Dr. Canfer to see if he could confirm. He discovered that the killer had made one strategic error, leaving the victim's teeth intact. Dental records are an incredibly valuable resource because they are a perfect form of identification when the teeth are intact. Even if teeth have been removed, there are still marks in the jawbone that a radiologist can compare, aiding the identification process. Police contacted Becky's family and requested access to her dental records. Long Island police brought them in person. Dr. Confer's office reviewed the dental records, examined the body's teeth, and found a match, as precise as fingerprints. Rebecca Koster of Long Island was indeed the woman found burned on the side of the road in Connecticut. Now, police had to go to her family's home to deliver the worst news they'd ever hear. Rebecca's mother had received the call from the detectives. They were waiting at the house. As she looked at the detectives, she asked, "You have bad news, don't you?" They replied, "Please sit down." They informed her they had found Becky, that it was a murder, and that they would do everything they could to find who did it to her. Rebecca's mother just grabbed her coat and ran outside, running halfway down the driveway screaming, "They killed my baby! Somebody killed my baby!" Detectives vowed to find out what caused this young woman to meet such a horrific end. They began by speaking with family and friends to try and reconstruct a timeline of Rebecca's last activities before she disappeared. Becky, 24 years old, was a beautiful young woman, looking exactly like her mom, and they were very close. She had been a nursing assistant and had gone to school to become a nursing assistant, working as an in-home care provider for developmentally disabled adults. Seeing her happy with her work made her mom feel like a successful parent. She was a very vibrant, very active young girl. Like most 24-year-olds, Becky was very social. She loved to go out and enjoy a good time. Detectives learned that on the night her daughter disappeared, Becky's mom had been working the night shift. Becky was home when her brother tried to get potato chips from her. Becky told her brother that she was going out with her best friend Nicole and her boyfriend at the time, Dan. They were going to their favorite spot to hang out for a while, then she would be home, to go to bed and head to work in the morning. Dan was Rebecca's boyfriend, but it wasn't a deep, long-term relationship. They had just started dating and it was certainly nothing serious. Becky's mom didn't really know Dan well. He seemed sincere in his feelings, seemed like a good person. Becky's mom knew they had some issues from what Becky had told her, but other than that, she didn't know as much as a mom typically would. Rebecca went out with her friends that night and then came home as promised. Rebecca contacted her mother via cell phone to report that she had made it home safely at around 3:30 a.m. In the middle of her night shift, Becky's mom's husband called to say that Becky hadn't shown up for work. Becky's mom called her but got no answer, left messages but got no call back. This was unlike Becky. It was very, very unusual for her not to be in contact or respond to her mom. Becky's mom went home, and the only thing she could think of was to contact Nicole. But Nicole had no idea where Rebecca was. She said that she went home early and left Rebecca with Dan and some other friends. Anyone last seen with a victim before they go missing will always be the prime suspect, and when you add a boyfriend to that, you always know who you're looking for. Detectives had a difficult time locating Dan and bringing him in. According to his statement, he and the others had dropped her off at 3:30 a.m. Dan said he walked her right to the front door, made sure she got in safely, and they left her there. That was the last time he saw or heard from her. Dan swore that he loved Becky and would never hurt Becky. Detectives offered Dan a chance to clear himself by taking a polygraph test. Investigators will often bring up this topic and ask a suspect if they're willing to take a polygraph to determine if they might be hiding something. If they're feeling hesitant or guilty about something, this is often used as a litmus test to try and see how guilty a person is. Dan took the polygraph test. The focus of the polygraph was whether he knew any information regarding her whereabouts or any information regarding the events leading up to her disappearance. The results of the polygraph indicated he was lying. Despite the unsettling results, investigators didn't believe Dan was involved in Rebecca's murder. Polygraphs can be used as an investigative tool, but they aren't 100% reliable. Dan had cooperated fully with the investigation. They had interviewed him thoroughly, and police had searched his home from top to bottom, and certainly there were no suspicious signs that she had ever been there. Police tried to corroborate everyone's statements with the others who were at the scene. Dan's story and his friends' stories were exactly the same, with no clear evidence linking Dan to Rebecca's murder. They needed to expand their suspect pool. Detectives turned to Dr. Canfer to establish a time of death. The victim had been seen at a bar and consuming alcohol. The average person metabolizes about 1 drink per hour. At the autopsy, samples were taken for drug and alcohol toxicology. The alcohol results were negative, as were the drug tests. When someone dies, their metabolism stops. That indicated she had been alive after leaving the bar for a period of time. Dr. Canfer estimated the time of death as 4 hours after Rebecca was last seen, but that was just his best guess. Truly an inexact science no matter what is written. Based on the estimated time of death, investigators needed to know if Rebecca had spoken to anyone after Dan dropped her off at 3:30 a.m. At 4:10 a.m., her family was able to pull up Rebecca Koster's call history on the computer to see who the last person she had been in contact with was. They saw that there were 2 incoming calls to her phone early that morning from the same number, which was 617. They called at 4:10 a.m. and at 4:27 a.m. It became clear that this person may have been the last one to speak to Becky. Detectives suspected that whoever Rebecca was on the phone with at 4:27 a.m. could have been the person who killed her. Becky Koster, like so many other young women, made a very foolish decision that night to believe that nobody could harm her. Becky never believed that anyone could hurt her. Her mother said, "Becky, you were a prime target because you were beautiful and everybody wanted you. There are monsters out there and they look like humans." Police were attempting to pinpoint the origination of the 2 incoming calls to Rebecca Koster's phone on the morning of her murder. Police were quickly able to obtain cell records for the phone numbers that had contacted Becky. When you talk on a cell device, your conversations are bounced off cell towers all across North America, and as you travel, your conversations are bounced from one tower to another. In this day and age, police can retrieve those records from providers, and through a not-too-complicated formula, they can ascertain a degree of certainty as to the area you are in. Police looked at the cell tower information. They could clearly determine that the person using that phone was mobile to communicate with her, and he was traveling in a west-to-east direction to Rebecca's home. The first call at 4:10 a.m. lasted about 15 minutes, and the call at 4:27 a.m. lasted about 20 seconds. So based on the cell tower locations and the duration of the final call, police believed this person was at Rebecca Koster's home, letting her know he was there, but they still didn't know who the caller was, or why Rebecca's body ended up in Connecticut 15 hours later. Police tried to contact that phone number but got no answer, and there were no phone records for the 617 number in their system, or anywhere they could find it. It was never listed. With heavy hearts, they surmised that phone number had to be tied to an untraceable burner phone. So, they didn't know whose 617 number it was. While investigators were trying to identify the person on the other end of the line, Dr. Kenfer was working to determine Rebecca's cause of death. Dr. Kenfer continued examining the body for other injuries that could have led to her death. One of the questions asked is whether the person was alive at the time of the fire. One way to detect that is to search for soot in the lungs of the deceased. If it is present, that tells you she was still breathing at the time of the fire. However, there is no soot in her lungs, from which you can infer that she died before the fire was set. External wounds on the skin were very difficult to find due to obscuring burns. Dr. Kenfer looked at all the vital organs, the heart, liver, lungs, kidneys. He observed a puncture in the liver, and, related to that stab wound, there were several hundred cubic centimeters of fluid and blood clots in the abdominal cavity. That told him she had a liver injury. She had also suffered 4 sharp force wounds to the neck. Dr. Kenfer wasn't sure if they occurred before or after death because they were partially obscured by burns. Veins in the neck as well as arteries could have been involved. If a person is alive and you cut one of the veins in the neck, there's a possibility that air is sucked into a vein, and if you have what they call a gas embolism, it will go to the heart and it simply prevents the heart from being able to pump, and the whole system will back up and you will die instantly in a very short period of time. Dr. Kenfer took x-rays to confirm his suspicions. He could see the level of air in the blood on the x-ray of the heart. That told him that the wounds to the neck, at least one of them, had happened when she was alive, and air was sucked into the venous system and went to the heart to stop it from beating. Because of multiple sources of wounds, Dr. Kenfer listed the official cause of death as due to all those causes. Detectives turned their attention to tracing Rebecca's movements. They learned from interviewing Rebecca's companions that they went to this bar called Butcher Boy. They were quickly able to determine that it had a surveillance system, and they could view and get all the surveillance footage from the night Becky was there. When they watched the footage, they could identify that Becky was indeed in the bar. She was sitting alone, her boyfriend and friends were talking to other people, and they could see this person approaching Becky. He was a little older, not 23 years old. He was dressed casually in what looked like a tank top and sweater, so he looked very humble. He entered her space and quickly got into a communicative interaction with her. For a period of time, watching the video, you could see both of them on their phones. It looked like they were exchanging some information. It appeared that this person took her phone and dialed a number. Based on what they had just seen, investigators re-interviewed those who were with Rebecca that night. One of them, a woman named Jennifer, remembered a new detail. She told them about a man at the bar she didn't know who was sitting next to them. She said this person made her very uncomfortable, that he was very provocative and seemed intimidating with the questions he asked her, and he actually took her phone and saved his name into her phone along with his number, hoping she would call him. So they took her phone and computer. Criminal detectives were able to extract information. They could see that a J. Brown had been added to her contact list with the number 617. They finally had a prime suspect for Rebecca's murder. The 617 number they saw on Rebecca Koster's phone profile was the same 617 number that this guy Jay had typed into Jennifer's phone. But before investigators had a chance to track down J. Brown, they received an urgent message from the Connecticut Crime Lab. A latent print examiner was able to process the tape wrapped around Rebecca's body, and they developed 2 fingerprints, one on the left and one on the right side of that tape. This is very, very rare to find fingerprints on sticky surfaces, especially when there's been a fire. Detectives sent the fingerprints to the state's databank. They did a physical comparison of the fingerprints on file with the state and concluded that there was an identification of both the left and right fingerprints belonging to Evans Ganthier. Within hours, investigators had located the two main suspects for this gruesome murder. Jay Brown had no criminal record, but the story was different for Evans Ganthier. He did have a criminal record, not too serious, but they were able to determine that among other things that police were very concerned about, he had had domestic incidents with his girlfriend, and there were allegations that he was pimping her out. He also enjoyed photographing women in his garage, so there were a few things on his resume that made investigators concerned. They asked witness Jennifer to return a second time. At this point, they knew Evans Ganthier's fingerprints were on the tape binding Rebecca Koster. So they took a photo of Evans Ganthier and put his picture in a photo array and showed it to Jennifer. Jennifer positively identified him as the one who took her phone, claiming to be Jay, and saved his number to her phone. This was a revelation. Jay Brown was not a separate man, but Evans Ganthier's alias. Investigators exhausted their resources in search of Ganthier. They knew he had a car that had been ticketed, and he had been caught driving this car, an SUV. They also knew that his girlfriend had a residence in the Bronx. So they surveilled and monitored where he stayed. One night, a team located his SUV, parked next to the residence where his girlfriend lived. The next day, they observed him walking to his car, and he was arrested. They took him to their headquarters, and I interviewed him, along with another detective. He consented to a search of his car, and he agreed to a search of his residence. Ganthier claimed there was nothing for the police to find because he had no hand in Rebecca's death. The residence was searched. In the garage, there was a roller, paintbrushes, a broom, concrete remover, some paint, and a paint tray. You could tell that an area had been wiped down and painted, and it looked definitely suspicious, but there was nothing that linked Rebecca Koster to that scene. But then his car was processed at the crime lab, and they discovered suspicious red spots all over the car. There was blood on the dashboard on the driver's side and on the passenger side. On the driver's side, there were blood stains and blood dripping down. If you've been in your car, you have a seatbelt buckle next to you, and you have a small gap between your seat and the dashboard. If you move the chair back and it goes down to the floor, that's where the blood accumulates. The investigators took blood samples found in the car and sent them for DNA testing. This blood was identified as Rebecca Koster's blood. So, they knew that Rebecca Koster had been in this car, and it looked like some violence had occurred with her when she was in this car. Investigators confronted Ganthier with this incriminating evidence, but instead of confessing, he began to tell a complicated defense story. He said, "I'll tell you what happened, but you're not going to believe it." He claimed that he had met her at the bar, they were just talking, and he decided he would call her because he wanted to continue his own party. She just gave him a ride to her house. Once in the car, he said that she explained she couldn't stay long because she had to go to work in the morning. And then, on the way to his house, she started foaming at the mouth, as if she were having a medical emergency. And when they arrived, he opened the garage door, and Becky was so unstable that she needed his support, and he had to wrap his arms around her just to get her into the garage and keep her on her feet. He declared that he took her into the house to try and give her some cups of water, and as they were walking in his garage, she tripped over a set of weights, slammed her head on the cement, and started bleeding profusely from her head. And so he went on to explain that he had put her in the back of his SUV and was going to drive her to Mather Hospital. And on the way to Mather Hospital, he said, he looked back and she had stopped breathing. As he drove her back to his home, she was dead, and he panicked. Evans Ganthier claimed he tried to hide Rebecca's identity and make her look like a missing person. He said he cut off her fingers and cut off her toes. He admitted to carving off a tattoo on her lower back. He then told police that he had in fact kidnapped her corpse, wrapped it in the trunk of his SUV, and driven to the Port Jefferson ferry. When he arrived in Connecticut, he just drove and ended up not far from Stonington. He didn't know what to do with her. He didn't harm her, he didn't kill her, but you know what he's going to do, because people aren't going to believe him. So he admitted to police that he had bought some gasoline, he drove around, and then he panicked even more because now he had been driving with her for so long, he just wanted to get her out of the car, so he just stopped in the area where her body was eventually found, threw her down the curb, poured some gasoline on her, and set her on fire. When you look at the sheer brutality and gruesome acts he committed, going to those levels is not concealment or covering up an accidental crime. You're trying to cover up a murder. Evans Ganthier admitted to having mutilated and burned Rebecca's body, but resolutely denied killing her, saying she died due to an accident. When someone is caught committing a brutal murder, and in their hearts they know that it's all over, the only thing left for them is to save face. And the way they do it is to try and minimize their involvement, to escape from the disgusting part of this murder. Evans Gantier was very, very convincing because, like most sick individuals, he had no soul, he had no conscience, and the only thing he cared about was protecting himself. He claimed that he just wanted to erase her identity, but it was clear that he was attempting to remove any evidence showing that she was brutally killed. Experienced homicide detectives have a good sense. They can often say, "This guy's just lying to me, I know." But you know that, and being able to make the suspect admit he's lying are two different things. And the most successful way is to confront him with the truth. Investigators needed Dr. Canford to dismiss Gantier's story. Otherwise, he might have gotten away with a much lesser crime. The crime would be, instead of murder, it would be abusing a corpse. So you have to prove that she was alive at the time of the incident. She was definitely alive with the stab wound to the liver, because there was bleeding into the liver, as well as fluid and blood clots in the abdominal cavity. And she was alive for at least one of the punctures to the neck, because we had an air embolism that came from air sucked in from one of the stabs in her neck. He told us that yes, she had stumbled, presumably on an object, hit her head hard, and that's why she died. But when I checked her head, there was no evidence of skull fractures, no evidence of subdural hemorrhage, there was no evidence of trauma. But the autopsy results showed that she had a stab wound to the neck, a stab wound to the liver, and that was the cause of her death, not this cockamamie story about her falling and banging her head. Equipped with the indisputable conclusions of the medical examination, detectives charged Gantier with second-degree murder. But even during the trial, he still insisted he was innocent. He was the victim throughout this whole thing. He did nothing. He was sorry for panicking, who didn't do the right thing. One of the most important points for the jury wasn't just proving the obvious, but also refuting the absurd. There was what I think was very convincing physical evidence. If you look at his story, she never bled in the front seat of that car. So the story was a lie. He stated that he put her in the back of his SUV, not the front passenger's seat. But according to him, there were no injuries, and he never placed her body in the front, even after he mutilated her body. So how would that blood have gotten there if it wasn't for a violent act that occurred in that car? The trial lasted 4 painful weeks. Rebecca's mother sat there every day, and her suffering was very clear, you could feel it. But she just wanted to make sure she was there for Becky, and she demanded justice for Becky. The family had not planned on attending the impeachment trial, and then her mother changed her mind. It was the court day that she found out about the things he did to her daughter, and her mind was in a fog ever since. It was the worst day of her life. After deliberating for only 5.5 hours, the jury found Evans Gantier guilty. The jury believed that the cause of death and the manner of death was homicide by stabbing, beyond any reasonable doubt. After the lengthy trial process, you can sit there in the courtroom with their families and listen to the jury's verdict. You can feel relieved when families feel a sense of closure that someone is having to take responsibility for what they did to their daughter. It was very important for the jury to declare him guilty. It was gratifying for us as prosecutors, for us to know that we got this terrible killer off the streets and got justice, and he will never roam the streets again. The judge sentenced Gantier to a maximum sentence of 25 years to life in prison and condemned his unimaginable atrocities following Rebecca's death. In Rebecca's case, if we didn't find out what happened to her, or with the help of the police find out who she would have simply been buried in Potter's Field, and nobody would have known anything. So, the medical examiner and police department spoke on behalf of the deceased. Yes, they concluded he was guilty. Yes, they were happy, but they were more relieved that he won't be out there harming anybody else. But that doesn't bring Rebecca Koster back to life. Her mother wished she could be the type of person who forgives, but in that case, she couldn't. Return to that quiet country road in Stonington, where the fire blazed in the dark. Now, perhaps only traces of ash remain, a small memento left by someone, a candle, a photo, or a child's shoe, commemorating a life unjustly taken. A young woman, just 24 years old, with dreams and a wide-open future, met her end in an agonizing and unspeakably brutal way. The death of Rebecca Koster is not just a personal tragedy, but a chilling wake-up call about the predators lurking in society, the monsters in human form, as her mother called them. What can we do to protect the most vulnerable among us? Is there a way to identify and stop those who harbor such grim darkness before it's too late? The story of Rebecca Koster reminds us that behind every heinous crime there is a life lost and a family shattered. It forces us to confront the hardest question: why can humans be so cruel? Remember Rebecca Koster, and let's work together so that such tragedies never happen again. Subscribe to True Crime Tales to not miss our next compelling and objective true